And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Genesis 11:4. Right after the flood, humanity was given a fresh start. But it didn't take long for the heart of man to rise up again in pride. They weren't seeking God. They wanted to become like Him. In this episode, we dive deep into the true story of the Tower of Babel, how a people united by pride tried to reach the heavens and were stopped by divine confusion. We'll witness the birth of nations, the fall of a godless project, and understand why Babel still speaks to our generation today. Chapter 1. After the flood, a new beginning. Judgment had passed. The waters that once covered the entire earth had receded. The ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, and Noah, with his family, stepped onto solid ground once more. Before them lay a new world, yet the same old human heart. Noah's first act was not to build walls or establish a city. He built an altar, he worshipped, and the Lord, seeing both his offering and his heart, responded with a covenant. "Never again will I curse the ground because of man." Genesis 8:21. God sealed this promise with a visible sign, the rainbow. A lasting reminder that even after judgment, his mercy still endures. That was the beginning of a new humanity. From his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, every nation on earth would come forth. Genesis 9:18-19. Over time, generations grew. People multiplied. Cities began to rise. What once had been a handful of survivors became an expanding society. Genesis 10, known as the Table of Nations, records the descendants of Noah's sons. A historical map of how the earth began to refill, tribe by tribe, name by name. But as their numbers grew, so did their self-confidence. The memory of the flood remained, but the fear of God began to fade. In this setting, a new spirit began to rise, not a spirit of worship and obedience, but of ambition and control. Instead of spreading across the earth as God had commanded, Genesis 9:7, mankind chose to stay together in one place, on the plain of Shinar. There they found fertile ground, a promising place to settle. What began as unity soon became silent. Rebellion. They weren't seeking God's will. They were seeking to make a name for themselves. And when a generation abandons the altar, it will inevitably raise a tower. They spoke one language. They had strength, and now they had an idea. Chapter 2. The Plain of Shinar, the idea that changed everything. They arrived in the plain of Shinar, a wide, fertile valley, ideal for living, farming, and more than anything else, building. The land was good, but the hearts of men were already drifting from their true purpose. Instead of spreading across the earth as God had commanded in Genesis 9:1, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth," they stopped. They stayed together. They organized around a new vision, no longer driven by obedience to heaven, but by the desire to build something on their own terms. It was there in Shinar that the idea took form. A proposal was raised among the people. "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens." Genesis 11:4. But this wasn't just an architectural project. It was a statement. They wanted more than safety. They wanted immortality. They craved recognition. To be remembered. Above all, they didn't want to be scattered. They weren't denying God's existence, but they were living as if they could replace him. The tower was a living metaphor of human ambition, reaching heaven without obedience. They were one people with one language. Genesis 11:1. They had communication. They had collective strength. They had resources. They had learned to make bricks and use tar for mortar. They knew how to build, But the problem wasn't their ability. It was their intention. Every brick laid was a rejection of dependence. Every upward step was a silent protest against heaven. The Tower of Babel was humanity's first great monument, built without an altar, without prayer, and without reverence. It was the ultimate symbol of collective pride. The same people who should have remembered the flood were now building as if they were untouchable. They had forgotten that salvation came not through construction, but through obedience. They had traded submission for ambition, worship for self-promotion. Your will be done had become, let us make a name for ourselves. They were organized, determined, convinced that nothing could stop them. And with that spirit, they began to raise the impossible. But there was one thing they had not considered. God was still watching, and heaven never ignores a tower built without fear. Chapter 3. A Tower for the Glory of Man. On the plain of Shinar, construction began. The bricks were shaped with precision. The tar sealed them tight. Voices moved in unison. Arms worked tirelessly. A city was taking form, but at the heart of the project, there was no altar, only a tower. This wasn't a temple for the Lord. It was a monument to man, an attempt to push beyond the boundaries of creation, a bold declaration of spiritual independence, as it's written, "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens." Genesis 11:4. They weren't trying to draw near to God, they were trying to replace him. It was Eden all over again, the same ancient desire, now multiplied through a crowd. If once a serpent had whispered, "You will be like God," now the people shouted it themselves. "We will be remembered." Their goal was clear: make a name. Not a name that honored the Creator, but one that made the creature unforgettable. They craved immortality, not by grace, but by effort. They sought heaven, not through faith, but through bricks. The tower rose, level by level, and with every added height so did their illusion of greatness. But the most dangerous part, they were united. One language, one direction, one ambition. No arguments, no hesitation, no division. It was a generation completely focused and completely wrong. That's the trap of collective pride, when everyone thinks the same way and no one thinks of God. They had lost the fear of the Lord, they ignored the covenant, they had forgotten the flood, and as the tower reached toward the skies, their hearts sank deeper into pride. But heaven was not silent. God watched, not with surprise, not with envy, but with holy justice, because no tower built by human hands can ever reach the place that belongs to the Almighty alone. And when the tower seemed unstoppable, God made a decision: he would come down. Chapter 4. Heaven comes down to judge. The tower kept rising, the city took shape, and in the hearts of men, one belief had taken hold: nothing could stop them. They were united, organized, relentless. They truly believed no limits would be placed on them, but heaven was watching. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Genesis 11:5. Not because he didn't know, not because he was far away, but to show that no matter how high man tries to climb, he will never reach the sovereignty of God. The Lord looked, and what he saw was dangerous: a people united, without reverence, a grand structure, without holy purpose, a progressive generation, spiritually empty. And then God declared, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them." Genesis 11:6. This wasn't a threat, it was a diagnosis. When humanity unites without God at the center, everything it builds turns against itself. So the Lord decided to act, but not with fire, not with earthquake, not with plague or disaster. He touched the very foundation of their civilization, language. "Come, let us go down," and they confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. Genesis 11:7. It was silent, it was precise, it was final. Suddenly, confusion. The words didn't match, the commands made no sense. Harmony shattered, understanding disappeared. One couldn't understand the other. Leaders grew frustrated, workers became angry. What once flowed, froze. And without communication there was no progress. Without clarity there was no construction. The project stalled. The tower was left unfinished, the city abandoned, and the name they had hoped would echo with glory was remembered as a warning. Babel, the place where God confused the language of man, where pride was exposed, where ambition met its limit. He didn't just stop a people. He established an eternal truth. No unity that ignores his presence will stand. And no tower built for the glory of man will survive the judgment of heaven. Chapter 5. Babel, where everything fell apart. What was built with such precision came to a halt. Not because of lack of resources, not because of weak hands, but because of something invisible, unexpected, and unstoppable. Language, the tower, once a symbol of human glory, became a tangle of voices. What had once been harmony turned into noise. Leaders gave orders. No one obeyed. Workers tried to continue, but no longer understood each other. Communication, the very foundation of the project, had become its collapse. As it is written, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Genesis 11:8. The project stopped. The city was left behind. The tower stood unfinished, and the name meant to be remembered for greatness became known for ruin. They called the place Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. There man's plan was shattered. There pride was interrupted. There God showed that he shares his glory with no one. What had been one people became many. One voice became a multitude of languages. One city dissolved into dispersion. But this wasn't destruction, it was mercy. God didn't wipe them out. He scattered them. He separated them to save them from themselves. Because when collective pride grows unchecked, it turns into idolatry. And in his justice, God will never let mankind destroy itself without intervention. The dispersion was a necessary interruption, a living reminder that God rules over the plans of men. He's not against progress. He's against pride that forgets his presence. Babel was left behind, a tower unfinished, an eternal symbol that man's strength has limits, and that every attempt to reach heaven without obedience ends in confusion. Chapter 6. The Scattering of Nations. Babel was left behind, and with it the collective dream of becoming one people under one name. The unfinished tower stood as a silent monument of failure. But to God, that moment wasn't just the end of a project. It was the beginning of a new chapter. From there, the scattering began. What once was a single society broke apart into tribes, families, and clans, each with its own language, each seeking a place to call home. Unity without reverence gave way to diversity under divine direction. As Scripture says, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth. Genesis 11:8. They went their separate ways. Some climbed mountains, others settled in valleys. They crossed rivers, braved deserts, built new cities. Nations were born, cultures emerged, languages took shape, and the map of humanity began to unfold. The confusion had been judgment, but the scattering was preservation. God didn't destroy the human race. He spread it out so that even in their brokenness, there would still be room to search, to repent, to find their way back to the Creator. He shattered their centralization to prevent evil from growing too large too fast. Each people group now carried a piece of the memory, the time when all spoke the same language. The tale of a tower left unfinished, and in many cases, a lingering fear of offending the gods. even if they had forgotten the one true God. And so what God had spoken to Noah was fulfilled. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. Genesis 9:1. Even if it happened through judgment, his will was done, because sooner or later, every plan of man must bow to divine sovereignty. The tower fell, but the story moved on. Every nation that rose, every language that formed, every people that took shape, it all began there, in that valley where man tried to reach the heavens. And God responded with dispersion. And even today, the languages of the world remain a living reminder of Babel, not as a curse, but as a sign that God is not only the Lord of Israel, but the Lord of all nations. Chapter 7. Babel is still among us. The tower fell, the city was abandoned, the people scattered, but the seed planted in Babel still grows, because Babel wasn't just a place, it was a spirit, an attitude, a mindset that still lives on in every generation that tries to build without God. Today, we no longer raise towers of brick and tar, but we build empires of pride. We construct systems where man's name is lifted up and God's name is left out. We create impressive structures, void of reverence. We launch grand projects without altars. We advance technology without fear. We chase power without a holy purpose. And the most dangerous part, we do it in unity. We align our voices. We centralize our messages. We pursue a single goal: to become as gods, masters of truth, keepers of time, architects of salvation. But God still watches, and just as in Genesis 11:5, he still comes down. He comes down to see. He comes down to judge. He comes down to interrupt what threatens the soul of humanity. Because no matter how advanced the world becomes, no civilization can ignore heaven for long. Babel is on the stages, in the palaces, in religious systems that have abandoned holy fear, in ideologies that seek to unite the world apart from truth, in hearts that want to build names, but not submission. Yet God still confuses languages, still breaks alliances forged in arrogance, still disrupts plans that defy his sovereignty, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. Dispersion then and now is still a form of preservation and confusion. Sometimes the only way to wake up are people who have forgotten the altar. But there's another side to the story. While Babel represents the division caused by pride, there is a promise of unity, restored, not by force, not by human strategy, but by the Spirit. At Pentecost, God reversed Babel. There he didn't confuse, he translated. Everyone heard the same message, in their own language. Acts 2:6, not to build a tower, but to proclaim a kingdom. Babel divided men. The Spirit brought them together, not around a human name, but around the name above every name. And that's why, even today, Babel still speaks. But the cross speaks louder. Final reflection. The story of the Tower of Babel is not about architecture, it's about pride. It's about what happens when humanity tries to take a place that belongs only to God, when unity is used not to seek his presence, but to avoid depending on it. They had everything: strength, strategy, vision, but they lacked the most important thing: submission. And in his justice, God did not allow it to continue. Not because he feared the tower, but because he loves too much to let man destroy himself with his own greatness. Babel reminds us that not every successful project carries God's blessing, not every unity is holy, and not every kind of progress is a sign of divine approval. Sometimes, confusion is mercy, dispersion is deliverance. The limits we face are protection, and the question that remains for us today is simple yet profound. What are we building, and for whom? Our name, or his? Our tower, or his altar? Babel is still alive wherever pride takes root, but it can still be left behind wherever surrender begins, and God is still searching. For those who, in the middle of this world's noise and confusion, choose to listen to his voice, because the story of humanity doesn't end in confusion. It ends in redemption, and the same God who came down to confuse at Babel also came down to save on Calvary.